It all started with a quiet Sunday morning in Brentwood, California. A sun-soaked neighborhood, manicured lawns, and a sprawling estate that belonged to one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, were inside their $13.5 million home, going about what should have been a normal day. But for reasons no one could have imagined, that day would end in unspeakable horror. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever wondered what could drive a person to kill the people who gave them life? Not a stranger, not an enemy, but their own parents? This isn't a story about a random act of violence. It's about betrayal, obsession, and the unraveling of a family from within. And at the center of it all was Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son of Rob and Michelle, living in the guest house on the property. The son everyone thought they knew, the son who seemed ordinary, who seemed normal, at least on the surface. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through Hollywood, through the media, and through every corner of the Reiner family's public image. Investigators arrived to find Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, both brutally stabbed inside their home. The scene was terrifying in its finality. Officers spoke in hushed tones, each one trying to process the sheer brutality of the act. And in the midst of this chaos, the focus quickly turned to the son living on the property, Nick Reiner. By the end of the night, Nick was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the story didn't end at the estate. In fact, the most shocking revelations were yet to come. After fleeing, or perhaps planning to flee, Nick checked into a hotel, a seemingly ordinary act that would soon reveal extraordinary secrets. What the FBI found in that hotel room would change the way this crime was understood forever. Hidden among ordinary belongings was a small, unassuming notebook. But this wasn't just any notebook. It contained detailed records, meticulous observations, and a grudging obsession with his own family. Inside, investigators found evidence that suggested Nick had harbored resentment, hatred, and potentially murderous intent for years. Imagine holding in your hands the written thoughts of someone who committed an unthinkable act. The FBI knew immediately that this notebook wasn't merely a diary, it was a roadmap. Every page offered a glimpse into a mind consumed by dark obsession. There were entries describing conflicts, perceived slights, and moments of simmering rage. Some were cryptic, some chillingly straightforward, but all of them pointed to a disturbing truth. Nick Reiner had been carrying a grudge against his parents, and he had meticulously documented it. The public reaction was instantaneous. Headlines screamed about betrayal, about horror, about the hidden darkness of a son who seemed, to the outside world, ordinary. And yet, for those closest to the family, none of this was entirely surprising. Friends, colleagues, even extended family members began speaking, hinting at signs they had seen, behaviors they had brushed off, and interactions that, in hindsight, were deeply unsettling. It raised a question that no one wanted to ask, but that everyone was thinking. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Could someone have seen the warning signs before it was too late? As the FBI pieced together the story, the hotel room became a focal point. Investigators approached it with caution, knowing that every item, every document, every scrap of paper could provide critical insight into the night of the murders. The notebook, when first discovered, seemed innocuous. But as agents began to open it, they realized that the contents were not only personal, they were methodical, precise, and, in some cases, frighteningly prescient. Entries described imagined grievances, moments where Nick felt wronged, and detailed accounts of interactions with his parents. Some entries were dated months, even years, before the murders. Others referenced specific events leading up to that fateful day in Brentwood. The pattern was unmistakable, a slow, building fixation that escalated into violent intent. Agents realized they were looking at not just a record of thought, but evidence of premeditation. A meticulous chronicle of a mind planning the ultimate betrayal. And yet, for all its dark detail, the notebook also contained contradictions. Some passages revealed vulnerability, moments of self-reflection, even guilt. These entries gave investigators a glimpse into the complexity of Nick Reiner, a son who, on one hand, seemed capable of love and normal interaction, but who, on the other hand, harbored a darkness that would culminate in unimaginable tragedy. It raised more questions than answers. Was this a cry for help, a journal of obsession, or a blueprint for murder? For the public, the notion that a son could keep such a detailed record of hatred and resentment was almost impossible to comprehend. Many tried to rationalize it, to find some external factor that could explain the inexplicable. Was it mental illness? Was it a history of trauma? Was it something in the dynamics of the Reiner household? Experts weighed in, psychologists analyzed passages, and every page was scrutinized for signs of motive, premeditation, and potential triggers. Meanwhile, the story captivated not only the media, but the wider public. Social media exploded with speculation. Debates raged over the morality and psychology of familial murder, and armchair detectives pored over every available detail. Yet, even amidst the public frenzy, law enforcement maintained a careful, methodical approach. Every discovery in the hotel room, every page in the notebook, had to be verified, cross-referenced, and analyzed. The stakes were high. They weren't just investigating a murder. They were piecing together a narrative that could define a family, a legacy, and a cautionary tale for years to come. And what of Nick himself? His behavior at the hotel, the way he attempted to hide or preserve the notebook, the choices he made after leaving the estate. These details painted a picture of a man who was both calculated and erratic. Some argued that his actions were consistent with someone trying to evade responsibility. Others suggested they were the actions of someone compelled to document his thoughts, to justify them, to record them in a way that might one day explain, even rationalize, what he had done. The FBI's discovery of the notebook marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. No longer were they simply dealing with a case of domestic homicide. They were now confronting a psychological labyrinth, a trail of writings that offered both insight and horror. Each page revealed layers of resentment, obsession, and planning. The investigators knew they were witnessing the aftermath of a mind consumed by its own narrative, a story that would eventually shock the world. Even at this early stage, the implications were staggering. How does a family recover when a child becomes the source of such devastation? How do investigators piece together motive from cryptic writings, some of which were almost stream of consciousness, others methodically detailed? And perhaps the most haunting question, what could anyone have done to prevent this tragedy? The answer, as the FBI would slowly come to realize, lay not just in the notebook itself, but in the broader context of Nick Reiner's life. Every relationship, every interaction, every subtle clue now took on new meaning. The notebook was not merely evidence. It was a window into a life that, from the outside, seemed ordinary, and from the inside, was deeply, disturbingly fractured. By the time investigators finished their initial review of the hotel room, one thing was clear: this was not a spontaneous act. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a culmination of years of festering resentment, meticulously recorded and horrifyingly acted upon. The world would soon learn the chilling details, and each revelation would prompt another wave of disbelief, shock, and sorrow. And yet, even with all that had been uncovered, the story was far from complete. The notebook was only the beginning. There were patterns yet to emerge, connections yet to be made, and secrets yet to surface. For every question answered, two more seemed to appear. And for everyone watching, the suspense was almost unbearable. What would the investigators uncover next, and how much darker could this story become? The answer would soon begin to unfold. Every page of that notebook, every detail of Nick Reiner's actions, every observation from friends, neighbors, and investigators would converge into a story so shocking, so incomprehensible, that it would redefine the boundaries of familial betrayal and true crime for a generation. It started like any ordinary Sunday in Brentwood, with sunlight filtering gently through the trees, birds chirping, and a quiet sense of suburban peace. But inside the grand $13.5 million estate of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, an unimaginable horror was about to unfold. By the end of the day, 2 lives would be brutally taken, a family torn apart, and a name synonymous with Hollywood excellence would be forever marred by tragedy. Have you ever thought about the thin line between peace and chaos? How a single day, a single decision, can change everything. For the Reiners, That line was crossed in a way no one could have predicted. Friends and neighbors later described the morning as serene, almost idyllic. Rob and Michelle were living what appeared to be a normal life, celebrated careers behind them, a comfortable home, and a son living in the guest house, who outwardly seemed harmless. But appearances, as they say, can be dangerously deceptive. The first signs that something was horribly wrong came not from a scream or a call for help, but from a chilling silence. The house was still, too still. A neighbor noticed the absence of the usual weekend activity and tried to reach the family, receiving no response. What began as minor concerns soon escalated into alarm when authorities were called. Upon arrival, officers were met with a scene that was both shocking and deeply unsettling. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were found inside their home, both brutally stabbed. The sheer violence of the act sent shivers down the spines of every officer present. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of rage. It was deliberate, methodical, and personal. The details of the scene suggested a level of anger and intent that was chilling in its precision. Every movement, every strike, had been calculated. As investigators combed through the estate, questions began to pile up. Who could have committed such a horrifying act? The immediate focus fell on the son, Nick Reiner, who resided in the guest house on the property. Why? Because in cases like this, the first suspect is often someone closest to the victims. And Nick had both proximity and opportunity. But mere suspicion was not enough. The authorities needed evidence, and evidence they would find, first at the scene, and then later in a hotel room that would become central to the investigation. The initial stages of the investigation were meticulous. Officers documented every corner of the estate, every trace of blood, every potential clue. Neighbors were interviewed, surveillance footage was reviewed, and timelines were reconstructed. Each small detail mattered. In true crime investigations, especially those involving family members, nothing is insignificant. A misplaced object, a forgotten conversation, or a seemingly minor behavior can be the thread that unravels the entire narrative. Meanwhile, the news of the murders began to spread. Within hours, headlines across media outlets screamed with shock, disbelief, and horror. Rob Reiner and wife stabbed to death in brutal attack, read one. Another asked, son arrested in tragic Hollywood family murder. The story gripped the public in a way few could have anticipated. People were horrified, not just because of the brutality, but because the idea of a son murdering his parents seemed unfathomable. For those who knew the Reiners personally, the tragedy hit even harder. Friends and family struggled to reconcile the image of Rob and Michelle, the loving parents, the pillars of their community, with the horror of what had occurred. And yet, whispers began to circulate. Some had noticed odd behaviors in Nick, subtle signs of resentment, frustration, or detachment. Could anyone have predicted this escalation? Could anyone have acted sooner? Amid the chaos, law enforcement quickly worked to establish a timeline. They traced Nick's movements, interviewed associates, and examined his communications. By nightfall, it became clear that Nick had left the estate, and the question of his whereabouts became urgent. Officers needed to locate him not only to bring him in, but also to understand his motives, his state of mind, and whether he posed further danger. What investigators would soon discover was both shocking and telling. Nick had checked into a hotel, attempting to create a temporary distance from the scene. But he wasn't running blindly. There was purpose in his movements. And there, in that hotel room, lay evidence that would shed a new, terrifying light on his relationship with his parents. A notebook that documented a simmering grudge, detailed observations, and an obsession with family dynamics that most would consider extreme, even pathological. Back at the estate, every detail of that day began to take on significance. Items were out of place. There were signs of struggle. And then there were the small, almost imperceptible clues. The way rooms were left, the positions of objects, subtle traces of behavior that, when pieced together, told a story of premeditation. This was not random. This was not impulsive. The investigators could sense, even before seeing the notebook, that the mind behind this act had planned it in a way that was both terrifying and methodical. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing. Friends remembered seeing Nick that morning, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And yet, The juxtaposition of normalcy and horror created a haunting paradox. How could someone who appeared ordinary harbor intentions so dark, so irreversible? It's a question that would haunt the investigation and the public alike. How well do we really know the people closest to us? How well did Rob and Michelle know their son? As the hours passed, law enforcement pieced together the events leading up to the murders. Small clues, a phone call, a text message, and observed behavior began to form a pattern. The preliminary assessment suggested that Nick had been contemplating this act for a significant period, and that the trigger was not spontaneous but part of a larger, more complex psychological and emotional narrative. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. While the murder itself was horrific, what the FBI would later discover in Nick's hotel room would provide context, motive, and insight that the estate alone could not offer. The notebook was not just a diary. It was a confession, a plan, a window into a mind consumed by resentment and fixation. And as investigators would later reveal, it contained details that were both disturbing and illuminating. Pages that chronicled not only grievances, but the step-by-step consideration of how the murders would occur and why. For the public, the immediate response was disbelief. How could a family, seemingly normal, be torn apart in such a violent and calculated manner? How could a son commit such an act, and what could drive him to it? And for law enforcement, the questions were even more pressing. Could the evidence from the hotel room provide a clear motive? Could it confirm premeditation? Would it hold up in court? And most importantly, could it prevent a tragedy like this from happening again in some other context? Every detail of that day, the quiet morning, the sudden violence, the initial investigation, was a piece of a larger puzzle. And as the public would soon learn, the tragedy was just the beginning. The hotel room, the hidden notebook, and the subsequent psychological revelations would deepen the shock and horror. They would reveal a story not just of murder, but of obsession, of hidden resentment, and of a mind meticulously planning a betrayal that would destroy an entire family. And as investigators followed the trail from the estate to the hotel, the narrative of that Sunday would take on a new, darker dimension. Nothing was as it seemed. The notebook would reveal thoughts, intentions, and grudges that had been building for years. Every page would challenge perceptions, every entry would shock, and every word would force both investigators and the public to confront the unimaginable, that someone capable of love could also harbor such a lethal darkness. But what came next would pull investigators even deeper into a world of secrets, obsessions, and meticulous planning. Secrets that had been quietly unfolding for years, unnoticed, until that day when tragedy struck. And in the center of it all was the question that would haunt everyone involved. Could any of this have been prevented? Who exactly was Nick Reiner? To the world, he was the son of Hollywood royalty. The name, Reiner, carried weight, history, and legacy. His father, Rob Reiner, was a celebrated director, actor, and producer, known for timeless classics and a career spanning decades. His mother, Michelle, was elegant, supportive, and deeply involved in the family's social and cultural life. To outsiders, Nick had the trappings of privilege, a life cushioned by fame and wealth. Yet, appearances can be deceiving. From the outside, Nick seemed like an ordinary young man, living in the guest house on his parents' estate, pursuing his own interests, and occasionally appearing in social circles. Friends described him as quiet, introspective, sometimes withdrawn, but rarely confrontational. Teachers, neighbors, and acquaintances spoke of a polite, even charming demeanor. But charm can be a mask. And in Nick's case, beneath that calm exterior lay a storm of resentment, anger, and obsession that few suspected existed. Nick's upbringing was far from unusual in Hollywood terms. He had access to elite schools, exposure to the entertainment industry, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. But wealth and privilege are no antidote to inner turmoil. According to some who observed him over the years, Nick had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy and isolation. Living in the shadow of a famous parent can be suffocating, and for some children, it can breed frustration, envy, and simmering resentment. Psychologists later analyzed Nick's behavior through the lens of his family dynamics. They noted patterns of attention-seeking, subtle defiance, and a growing disconnect from both peers and family. Some entries in his eventual notebook hinted at a perceived imbalance in parental attention, moments where he felt overlooked, slighted, or judged. To a casual observer, these might seem like typical adolescent frustrations. But, as investigators would later piece together, for Nick, these grievances festered, compounded over time, and became a central part of his inner narrative. It wasn't just about attention. There were hints of a deeper, more insidious pattern, a fixation on control and power within his family relationships. In the pages of his notebook, he meticulously recorded interactions with his parents, sometimes trivial, sometimes deeply personal, and often twisted into evidence of perceived wrongdoing. Each note, each observation, revealed a mind analyzing, calculating, and justifying feelings of anger and frustration. Nick's relationships outside the family also painted a complex picture. Friends who spoke with investigators described him as both magnetic and difficult, someone capable of deep empathy in private, but quick to withdraw when challenged or confronted. Colleagues mentioned his intelligence, his creative thinking, and his articulate nature. Yet, for every positive remark, there were warnings, subtle signs of instability. Moments of intense mood swings, periods of withdrawal, and behaviors that hinted at obsessive tendencies. One of the most revealing aspects of Nick's personality was his ability to compartmentalize. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, perhaps even charming. He maintained social appearances, engaged in hobbies, and participated in family events. But privately, he harbored thoughts and obsessions that were darker, more volatile, and, ultimately, dangerous. This duality, ordinary son versus secretive, brooding observer, was key to understanding the events that would unfold. Investigators, after reviewing his notebook and other evidence, noted recurring themes in Nick's behavior: resentment of authority, fixation on perceived slights, meticulous attention to detail, and a growing fascination with the idea of revenge. These patterns were subtle enough to evade detection in daily life, but pronounced enough to become deadly when combined with opportunity and intent. Even within the family, there were signs. Friends and relatives recalled arguments, moments of tension, and exchanges that hinted at underlying conflict. Some of these conflicts were trivial on the surface, arguments over chores, inheritance, or personal choices, but through the lens of obsession, they took on enormous significance in Nick's mind. The notebook revealed that he reinterpreted these moments as evidence of rejection, injustice, or betrayal, cataloging each perceived slight with painstaking detail. It is essential to recognize that Nick's case was not just about mental instability. It was about the intersection of personality, opportunity, and obsession. The FBI later explained that while many people harbor resentment or frustration, very few act on it with such premeditated violence. Nick's writings demonstrated an evolution from thought to intent, from private grievance to lethal action. The dichotomy of Nick's life became increasingly apparent. By day, he lived among the symbols of privilege, luxury, family legacy, Hollywood acclaim. By night, in the solitude of his guest house or eventually his hotel room, he cultivated thoughts that would culminate in murder. He wrote, he observed, he plotted, and he rationalized. Each page of his notebook served as both confession and blueprint. What drove him to write such meticulous records? Was it a compulsion, a cry for help, or a calculated effort to document a plan before executing it? Experts suggested that Nick may have been engaging in a form of self-justification, using the notebook to validate his anger, catalog his grievances, and mentally prepare for the act he ultimately carried out. This combination of documentation and psychological preparation is rare, yet chilling, offering a window into the mind of someone on the brink of committing a horrific crime. Despite the darkness that would later emerge, it is crucial to understand that Nick Reiner's story is layered, complex, and at times contradictory. He was capable of charm and connection, intelligence and insight, moments of vulnerability and self-awareness. Yet, these qualities existed alongside obsession, resentment, and escalating hostility toward the very people who loved him most. Friends recalled instances that, in hindsight, seemed to foreshadow the tragedy. Arguments with his parents that escalated disproportionately, moments of withdrawal that lasted days, and sudden bursts of anger over seemingly minor incidents. While no single event predicted murder, the cumulative pattern revealed a growing instability. A psychological pressure cooker ready to explode. And then there was the role of isolation. Living in the guest house, separate yet close to his parents, Nick maintained physical proximity without necessarily sharing emotional connection. This environment, coupled with his internal obsessions, created a feedback loop in which his grievances festered, intensified, and became central to his identity. The notebook would later reveal just how meticulously he chronicled this inner turmoil. By the time investigators pieced together the events of that fateful Sunday, they had begun to see the full picture. A man whose outer life suggested ordinariness, yet whose inner world was consumed by resentment, obsession, and fixation. The tragedy was not a sudden eruption. It was the culmination of years of simmering tension, meticulously documented in a way that would horrify anyone who read it. Nick Reiner was no longer just the son of a Hollywood legend. He was a suspect, a figure of investigation, and, ultimately, a central character in a story of betrayal and horror. Every word he had written, every action he had taken, every interaction he had with his parents, all of it would now be scrutinized under the harsh light of investigation. And as authorities delved deeper, they would uncover the evidence that tied his inner narrative to the violent reality that had shattered the Reiner family forever. But what came next? The hotel room, the hidden notebook, and the meticulous records of obsession would reveal a side of Nick Reiner that the world was not ready to see. And it was in that hidden room, away from the estate and the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, that the chilling truth of his grudge would finally come to light. The night of the murders had barely settled when Nick Reiner disappeared. Not a dramatic escape into the darkness of the city, not a frenzied attempt to flee justice, but a calculated, deliberate move that would soon draw the attention of the FBI. After committing one of the most shocking acts imaginable, he did something almost mundane. He checked into a hotel. But this seemingly ordinary decision would become one of the most consequential moves in understanding the crime. Have you ever considered what goes through a person's mind in the hours after committing an unthinkable act? Some panic, some hide in the shadows, others flee with the intent never to return. Nick's actions suggested a mixture of instinct, calculation, and something far more disturbing, the need to preserve evidence of his own thoughts. While the murder itself was horrifying, what he did next would provide investigators with a crucial window into his psyche. The hotel was a standard, quiet place, chosen neither for luxury nor anonymity, but seemingly for convenience. Nick booked a room, checked in under his own name, and attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. To anyone watching from the outside, it would appear he was just another guest. But inside that room, hidden among personal belongings, lay evidence that would later shock the world. A small notebook, meticulously kept, detailing his grievances, observations, and thoughts about his parents. The FBI approached the situation with caution. After all, this was no ordinary investigation. They weren't dealing with a random criminal or a one-off act of violence. They were dealing with a son who had murdered his own parents, and now the focus was on understanding why, how, and what evidence had been left behind. When agents entered the hotel room, the atmosphere was tense. Every object could be a clue. Every note could reveal motive. And the notebook, when discovered, became the centerpiece of the investigation. What made this notebook extraordinary wasn't just that it existed. It was the depth and detail of its contents. Nick had chronicled years of interactions with his parents, cataloged perceived injustices, and recorded his own emotional reactions with a precision that was both methodical and disturbing. Some entries read like diary reflections, while others resembled plans, calculations, and analyses of behaviors. The FBI quickly recognized that they weren't just looking at a collection of personal thoughts. They were looking at evidence of premeditation. For investigators, the discovery raised immediate questions. How long had Nick been keeping this notebook? Was it an outlet for his frustrations, or was it a deliberate preparation for murder? And most chillingly, had he anticipated the consequences of his actions and planned to document them for posterity? As they leafed through the pages, the depth of obsession became apparent. Every grievance, every minor dispute, every perceived slight was cataloged, annotated, and often interpreted as evidence of betrayal or injustice. The meticulousness was unsettling. Nick's writing was neat, deliberate, and often cryptic. Some pages contained seemingly mundane observations, while others detailed emotional conflicts that hinted at a growing resentment. Investigators noted patterns. Entries corresponding to family interactions, escalating anger over time, and moments of fixation that suggested a mind moving inexorably toward violence. And yet, the notebook was not solely filled with anger. Some passages revealed introspection, moments where Nick questioned his own thoughts or acknowledged his own frustrations. These entries were sporadic, fleeting, and often overshadowed by the weight of his resentment, but they added complexity to the profile investigators were building. Here was a man capable of self-awareness, yet so consumed by anger and fixation that he could act on it in the most extreme way imaginable. As the FBI examined the room, they discovered other items that, at first glance, appeared ordinary: clothing, toiletries, personal effects. But every object became a potential clue. Surveillance footage from the hotel corroborated Nick's presence and movements, while digital devices hinted at communications that were later cross-referenced with the notebook. Investigators were slowly piecing together a timeline, from the moment he left the estate to the hours spent at the hotel. The psychological portrait began to take shape. Here was a man who had not only committed a horrific act, but had also created a space where he could reflect, rationalize, and perhaps even glorify it in his own mind. The hotel room was a sanctuary for his obsession, a private stage where he could confront his grievances, organize his thoughts, and solidify his narrative. And the notebook, carefully hidden yet deliberately preserved, was the script of his internal world, a world that had culminated in the ultimate act of violence. What made the discovery particularly significant was how it tied together elements of opportunity, premeditation, and motive. While investigators had evidence from the crime scene itself, the notebook provided context. It answered questions that physical evidence alone could not. Why Nick acted, what he felt, and how he viewed his parents in the lead-up to the murders. The pages were both confession and justification, a chilling combination that painted a complete picture of the man behind the crime. Friends and family reactions to the news of the notebook's discovery were immediate and intense. Many were shocked that Nick had kept such detailed records, while others began to reflect on warning signs they had perhaps ignored. Could anyone have predicted this outcome? Could intervention have prevented it? And perhaps most hauntingly, what else might he have documented, hidden away, that investigators had yet to uncover? As the hours turned into days, the FBI continued their meticulous examination. Every page, every annotation, and every minor detail in the hotel room became part of the larger puzzle. Analysts began cross-referencing entries with known interactions, reconstructing timelines, and identifying patterns that suggested escalating intent. Each discovery heightened the sense of premeditation, reinforcing the conclusion that these murders were not impulsive, but the culmination of long-standing grievances carefully nurtured over time. The hotel room was more than just a temporary refuge. It was the epicenter of a hidden narrative, one that revealed the depth of Nick Reiner's obsession with his family. It exposed the lengths to which he had gone to document, rationalize, and prepare for actions that would ultimately shatter the lives of those closest to him. The notebook, in particular, would become central in court, providing both prosecutors and psychologists with insight into the motives, planning, and mindset that had driven the crime. And yet, even with all this evidence, investigators were aware that the notebook could only tell part of the story. Actions, behaviors, and interactions outside its pages were equally important. Every conversation, every digital footprint, every interaction with friends and acquaintances could shed light on the complexity of Nick's personality and the evolution of his resentment. But what came next? The full examination of the notebook, the uncovering of detailed plans, and the chilling insight into his mind would reveal a level of obsession that went far beyond ordinary family disputes. What the FBI found in that hotel room would not only shock investigators, but would also leave the public grappling with questions about morality, sanity, and the terrifying potential for darkness that can exist behind a familiar face. When the FBI agents first laid eyes on the notebook, it seemed innocuous, just a small, unassuming journal tucked neatly among Nick Reiner's personal belongings in the hotel room. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as the private musings of an ordinary young man. But investigators quickly realized that this was no ordinary diary. The handwriting was meticulous, the entries detailed, and the content disturbing beyond imagination. From the very first page, the notebook hinted at a dark, simmering obsession that had been quietly building over years. Have you ever wondered what a person might write if no one would ever see it? A true window into the mind, unfiltered and raw. That's exactly what the FBI had found. A chronicle of thought, grievance, and fixation so detailed that it bordered on pathological. As agents flipped through the pages, they realized they were looking at more than just personal reflections. This notebook was a map, a psychological roadmap leading directly to the murders. The first entries appeared harmless, almost trivial. Notes about daily interactions with his parents, observations about their behavior, and personal reflections on minor disagreements. But as the pages progressed, a pattern emerged. What seemed like simple frustration transformed into resentment, and that resentment evolved into fixation. Nick meticulously cataloged perceived injustices, moments when he felt ignored, belittled, or overlooked. The entries weren't emotional outbursts. They were careful, deliberate recordings of every grievance, every slight, every perceived betrayal. Investigators noted the precision of his writing. Each entry was dated and often referenced specific events. Some passages described conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but were reinterpreted in his mind as evidence of rejection or favoritism. Other entries hinted at jealousy, anger, and a growing sense of entitlement. Nick's obsession was not casual, it was methodical. He wasn't just angry, he was strategizing, analyzing, and, in some cases, planning. One page described a seemingly minor family dinner, but Nick had annotated it extensively, noting facial expressions, tones of voice, and perceived judgments. To anyone else, it would appear trivial. But within the context of the notebook, it revealed the intensity of his scrutiny and the way ordinary interactions were magnified into evidence of maltreatment. The FBI realized they were witnessing a mind that had been cataloging its own narrative for years, a mind preparing for a confrontation that would ultimately be lethal. What made the notebook even more chilling were the entries that directly referenced anger toward his parents. Nick described feelings of frustration and betrayal in clinical detail, as if he were dissecting the psychology of his own resentment. Some passages included imagined confrontations, daydreams of revenge, and hypothetical scenarios in which he exerted control over his parents. These weren't fleeting thoughts. They were rehearsed fantasies, written down with precision and clarity. The notebook also revealed contradictions that painted a complex psychological portrait. There were passages where Nick expressed guilt or confusion, acknowledging that some of his anger was irrational or unjustified. Yet these moments of self-awareness were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by detailed justifications for his resentment. This duality, a mix of insight and obsession, gave investigators an unnerving glimpse into the complexity of his mind. He could reflect on his actions, yet remain fixated on revenge. As the FBI continued to comb through the notebook, they discovered passages that were far more explicit, chilling in their intent. Some entries hinted at premeditation, describing scenarios in which harm would come to his parents. Others recorded steps he could take to avoid suspicion or consequences. The level of detail suggested that this was not a crime of impulse but one that had been carefully considered, rehearsed in his mind, and documented as a plan. What truly shocked investigators were the recurring themes of control and dominance. Nick's writings revealed an obsession with asserting power over his parents. An almost compulsive need to prove himself, to right perceived wrongs, and to establish authority in the relationship. He chronicled moments when he felt marginalized or belittled, magnifying them into evidence of a lifetime of grievances. The notebook was less a journal of daily life than a ledger of perceived injustices, each meticulously annotated to reinforce his narrative. Even the seemingly mundane details were haunting. Notes about household routines, personal habits, and casual conversations were included with surprising frequency. Each observation was recorded as though it held some greater significance. Investigators recognized a pattern common in obsessive behavior: the fixation on minutiae, the constant monitoring of others' actions, and the reinterpretation of ordinary events as evidence of wrongdoing. Experts later analyzed the notebook and identified clear signs of obsessive-compulsive tendencies intertwined with narcissistic traits. The writing revealed someone who viewed the world through a lens of personal grievance, interpreting minor slights as monumental betrayals. The meticulous documentation served multiple purposes. It validated his feelings, justified potential actions, and created a narrative in which he was the victim of a lifetime of perceived injustices. As the investigation progressed, the notebook became central to the case. It provided a direct line to motive, intent, and mindset, critical elements in establishing premeditation for first-degree murder charges. Prosecutors recognized its power immediately. It was not just a record of thought, but a self-authored confession of sorts, linking Nick to a carefully documented trail of grievances, obsessions, and ultimately, murderous intent. Friends and acquaintances were shocked when they learned about the notebook. Some had suspected that Nick struggled with emotional challenges, but no one imagined that his private musings would reveal such a level of fixation and animosity. The contrast between the outwardly polite, sometimes charming young man and the obsessive, calculating mind revealed in the notebook was staggering. How could someone who seemed so ordinary harbor such dangerous thoughts? The FBI also discovered that the notebook contained entries that tied directly to events leading up to the murders. Dates, locations, and specific interactions with his parents were chronicled in a way that allowed investigators to reconstruct the timeline and understand the progression of his obsession. This level of detail was crucial. Not only did it illustrate motive, but it also confirmed that the act was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of resentment, carefully nurtured and documented. Some entries were cryptic, almost symbolic, requiring careful interpretation by forensic psychologists. Symbols, shorthand notes, and seemingly coded language revealed a mind attempting to organize and rationalize dark thoughts. Investigators realized that Nick had created a self-contained world in which his actions were justified, necessary, and even inevitable. The notebook was both a reflection and a blueprint, merging thought and intent into a chilling narrative. And yet, despite the horror, the notebook also contained moments of vulnerability. Passages where Nick questioned himself, expressed doubt, or showed fleeting awareness of wrongdoing. These moments, rare and brief, highlighted the internal struggle between obsession and conscience, a struggle that ultimately tipped in favor of violence. It was this duality that made the notebook so compelling and disturbing, providing investigators with insight into the complex interplay of thought, emotion, and action. The discovery of the notebook marked a turning point in the investigation. It was the key that unlocked motive, illuminated intent, and revealed the psychological landscape that had led to the murders. Every entry, every annotation, every observation became evidence, creating a chilling portrait of a son who had documented his grievances and allowed them to metastasize into deadly action. But what investigators hadn't yet fully grasped were the depths of Nick's obsession, the entries that hinted at future actions, that revealed the scope of his planning, and that suggested a level of fixation so extreme it defied belief. What came next, as the FBI continued their analysis, would shock even seasoned investigators and bring to light the most disturbing aspects of Nick Reiner's hidden world. From the first page of the notebook to the last, one theme became chillingly clear. Nick Reiner harbored a deep, simmering grudge against his parents. It wasn't fleeting or situational. It was a persistent obsession that had been nurtured over years, quietly festering until it erupted in the most horrifying way possible. The entries left the FBI and psychologists alike grappling with a single terrifying question. How could a son document such resentment so meticulously, and then act on it with lethal intent? Have you ever wondered what it takes for a grudge to turn into action? Many of us hold grudges, carry resentment, or feel wronged, but most never allow these feelings to dictate their behavior. In Nick's case, however, the notebook revealed an escalation from simple anger to a full-blown, obsessive narrative of revenge. Every grievance he had ever felt, real or imagined, was cataloged, analyzed, and amplified, creating a distorted lens through which he interpreted every interaction with his parents. The FBI noted patterns in his writings: small slights, being told to clean his room, receiving criticism, or even perceived favoritism toward other family members, were magnified in his mind and meticulously recorded. Nick did not merely feel slighted. He documented these moments as evidence of injustice, often adding commentary on the unfairness of his treatment. To him, these entries validated a growing narrative in which he was a victim and his parents were the perpetrators of emotional cruelty. But the grudge was deeper than simple resentment. Certain passages revealed long-standing anger, a belief that his parents had systematically undermined him or failed to acknowledge his worth. Some entries described imagined scenarios in which his parents humiliated or belittled him, while others replayed real events and interpreted them as proof of a lifetime of favoritism or neglect. It was as if he had turned every moment of his life into a case study of perceived betrayal. The notebook also illustrated how Nick's grudge had evolved into obsession. He didn't merely note the incidents. He analyzed them, hypothesized motivations, and projected future behavior. He cataloged every argument, every raised voice, every critical remark, examining it as though he were preparing for confrontation. Each entry built upon the last, creating a timeline of anger and resentment that foreshadowed the ultimate act of violence. Psychologists reviewing the notebook described a pattern consistent with what they call ruminative obsession. Nick didn't just think about these grievances. He relived them repeatedly, amplified them, and wove them into an ongoing narrative that justified anger, justified planning, and ultimately justified violence. His fixation was methodical, detailed, and deeply personal, targeting the very people who had nurtured him from birth. What made the grudge even more disturbing was its pervasiveness. Nick documented not only events that involved direct interactions with his parents, but also their routines, habits, and behaviors that he interpreted as slights. He noted their schedules, their social interactions, and even their conversations with friends and family. To an outsider, these might seem like obsessive attention to mundane details, but in the context of the murders, they became evidence of premeditation. Every observation reinforced the narrative he had constructed over years, that he had been wronged, that he had been overlooked, and that revenge was justified. Some entries were almost clinical in their analysis. Nick would describe an event, then dissect the emotions, reactions, and potential consequences. He examined how his parents might perceive him, what they might think, and how he could manipulate or control the situation. This level of detail revealed a mind that was constantly evaluating, plotting, and rehearsing, one step removed from the act itself, yet steadily moving toward it. In addition to documenting grievances, the notebook also reflected a growing sense of entitlement. Nick believed that he had been denied recognition, opportunities, or respect, and he meticulously rationalized why he deserved to reclaim what he perceived as rightfully his. These passages were interwoven with anger, frustration, and at times, bitter humor, an ironic undertone that highlighted the cognitive dissonance between his perception of himself and the reality around him. Investigators noted that the grudge was not confined to minor annoyances. Certain entries explicitly referenced violent fantasies, hypothetical confrontations, and methods by which he might assert control over his parents. These were not idle musings. The notebook revealed a progression. Grievance turned to obsession, obsession turned to planning, and planning ultimately manifested in the horrific actions that had taken place at the Brentwood estate. Forensic psychologists emphasized the importance of these entries in understanding motive. While physical evidence tied Nick to the scene, the notebook provided context, clarity, and insight into the emotional and psychological mechanisms driving his actions. It wasn't enough to prove opportunity or access. Motive required understanding why, and the grudge documented in painstaking detail offered a direct window into his mind. Friends and family who learned of the notebook were horrified, but in some cases, they recognized glimpses of Nick's personality in its pages. Arguments, mood swings, and moments of frustration that had once seemed ordinary now took on new significance. In retrospect, there were warning signs, subtle indicators of a fixation that had long been ignored or misunderstood. The notebook crystallized what had been invisible, that this grudge was real, deep, and ultimately lethal. Perhaps most unsettling was the way the grudge intersected with Nick's perception of control. The notebook revealed a belief that he could manage, manipulate, and dominate the narrative of his family interactions. Every page was an assertion of mental power over his parents, a form of control he lacked in real life but compensated for through writing. This psychological framework laid the groundwork for the violence that would eventually erupt, turning private resentment into public tragedy. Even amidst the anger and obsession, the notebook revealed glimpses of self-awareness. Nick occasionally questioned his own thoughts, acknowledged that some interpretations might be exaggerated, or noted fleeting regret. Yet these reflections were brief and insufficient to derail the larger narrative. The grudge had become the dominant force, overriding conscience, empathy, and familial bonds. As investigators continued their analysis, the full scope of the grudge became clear. This was not a simple familial dispute. It was a chronic, escalating fixation that had been carefully documented, rehearsed mentally, and ultimately enacted with devastating consequences. Every grievance recorded, every interaction dissected, and every imagined slight contributed to a psychological architecture of anger that led directly to the murders. By the end of their initial review, the FBI understood the power of what they had uncovered. The notebook was not just evidence. It was a confession, a psychological profile, and a roadmap all in one. It revealed the motivations, the emotions, and the thought processes that had driven a son to commit the unthinkable. And for the public, the revelation of this grudge would transform the tragedy from a shocking event into a cautionary tale about obsession, resentment, and the destructive potential of unresolved anger. But what came next? The deeper, darker entries, the cryptic passages hinting at premeditation and future intent, would push investigators even further into the chilling world of Nick Reiner's mind. The grudge was only the beginning, and what lay ahead in the notebook would reveal a level of fixation and planning that no one could have imagined. As the FBI and forensic psychologists delved deeper into Nick Reiner's notebook, they began to construct a chilling psychological profile of a young man whose mind had been consumed by obsession, resentment, and fixation. This was not a profile based solely on actions. It was a window into the thought processes, emotional patterns, and personality traits that had led a son to murder his own parents. What emerged was a portrait both fascinating and horrifying. Have you ever wondered what drives a person to turn deep-seated anger into violence? Many of us experience frustration, jealousy, or resentment, but few ever act on it with lethal intent. Nick's writings revealed a combination of traits that, together, created a perfect storm. Meticulous attention to detail, obsessive rumination, a sense of entitlement, and a persistent grudge that eclipsed empathy or conscience. Psychologists noted several key traits in Nick's profile. First was his obsessive-compulsive tendency to document, analyze, and catalog every perceived grievance. This was not casual journaling. It was meticulous, structured, and continuous over years. Each interaction with his parents, each argument, each perceived slight, was recorded, dissected, and interpreted. This level of obsession allowed him to rehearse grievances mentally, reinforcing a narrative in which he was the victim and his parents were the perpetrators. Second was his pattern of rumination. Nick didn't merely feel angry. He relived every negative interaction repeatedly, often amplifying perceived slights and creating hypothetical scenarios in which his parents' behavior justified retaliation. Experts described this as a dangerous feedback loop. The more he ruminated, the more entrenched his resentment became, ultimately normalizing the idea of revenge as a viable solution. A third trait was his sense of entitlement. Nick appeared to believe that he deserved recognition, respect, and control over his family dynamics. Entries revealed a recurring theme. He was being denied his rightful position, undervalued, or ignored. This perceived injustice, when combined with obsessive documentation, created a psychological environment in which anger and justification reinforced each other. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the profile was the juxtaposition of charm and obsession. Outwardly, Nick could appear calm, polite, even engaging. Friends, acquaintances, and casual observers might never suspect the depth of his resentment. But the notebook revealed a private world where these outward appearances masked a relentless mental narrative of anger, grievance, and planning. This duality, a normal facade over a dangerous inner life, is a hallmark in many cases of familial homicide and obsessive behavior. The profile also highlighted a lack of empathy and an impaired capacity for moral reasoning. While Nick occasionally questioned his own thoughts in fleeting moments of doubt, these were brief and quickly overshadowed by the dominant narrative of grievance and revenge. He could understand, at least intellectually, that harming his parents was wrong, but the intensity of his obsession diminished the influence of conscience. The emotional weight of perceived slights became more powerful than moral reasoning, paving the way for violent action. Investigators noted cognitive distortions in his writings. Nick repeatedly reframed ordinary interactions as proof of malice or neglect, often exaggerating events to fit his narrative. This type of distorted thinking is common in individuals with deeply ingrained grudges and can intensify the perceived justification for harmful actions. Each entry reinforced his belief that retaliation was not only justified but necessary. Another critical element of the profile was Nick's meticulous planning. His notebook contained passages that hinted at premeditation, hypothetical scenarios, contingency plans, and detailed observations of his parents' routines. While some entries were hypothetical, others suggested he had mentally rehearsed the act, considering timing, opportunity, and outcome. This combination of obsession and calculated thought indicated a dangerous convergence of psychological factors, the desire to act on grievance coupled with the ability to plan methodically. Psychologists also considered the impact of family dynamics on his development. Being the son of a high-profile Hollywood figure comes with unique pressures, expectations, public scrutiny, and a sense of comparison. While many children in similar situations navigate these pressures without harm, Nick appeared to internalize perceived inadequacies and injustices, amplifying them into personal grievances. The notebook reflected how ordinary familial tensions had escalated into a consuming narrative of victimhood and revenge. Additionally, experts noted social isolation as a contributing factor. Living in the guest house, physically close to his parents but emotionally distant, created an environment in which obsessive thoughts could flourish unchecked. Nick had access to his parents' routines, their habits, and private interactions, which he then documented extensively. This proximity, combined with isolation and obsession, allowed his grievances to fester and develop into a dangerous fixation. The FBI also observed evidence of cognitive rigidity. Once Nick had constructed a narrative of grievance and revenge, it became almost impossible for him to reinterpret events objectively. He reinforced his beliefs through meticulous record-keeping, creating a feedback loop in which his obsessions became self-sustaining. This rigidity reduced the likelihood of seeking help, empathy, or alternative perspectives, further increasing the risk of violent behavior. Finally, the profile highlighted the convergence of fantasy and reality. While many entries were observational or reflective, some ventured into imagined scenarios of confrontation, control, and retribution. Psychologists emphasized that when obsession, resentment, and planning intersect, fantasy can easily translate into action. Nick's writings revealed precisely this convergence: detailed, persistent, and dangerous. By the end of their analysis, investigators and psychologists had a clear understanding of Nick Reiner's mental landscape. He was a young man whose inner world was dominated by obsession, resentment, and perceived injustice. His meticulous record-keeping, combined with rumination, entitlement, and impaired empathy, created a perfect storm that culminated in the murders of his parents. The notebook was both a window into his mind and a roadmap of his descent from grievance to lethal action. But even as the profile became clear, the investigation was far from complete. While the notebook illuminated motive and planning, it raised even deeper questions. How had Nick's obsession gone unnoticed for so long? Could anyone have intervened? And most chillingly, what other passages in the notebook, still unexamined, would reveal the darkest corners of his mind? What came next would push investigators further into territory so disturbing that even seasoned professionals found themselves grappling with disbelief. The psychological profile was only the beginning. The notebook held secrets that went beyond motive, revealing the full scope of Nick Reiner's fixation and the meticulous planning that led to the unthinkable. When a tragedy like this occurs, people often look back and ask, were there warning signs? In the case of Nick Reiner, the answer was both haunting and complicated. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, quiet, polite, and even charming in casual interactions. But hidden beneath that calm exterior were subtle indicators of obsession, resentment, and psychological turmoil that, in hindsight, painted a chilling portrait of a young man teetering on the edge of violence. Have you ever missed something right in front of you? Many of Nick's friends, neighbors, and even extended family later admitted that there were moments that seemed odd, concerning, or out of character. But at the time, no one connected the dots. Perhaps it was denial, or perhaps it was a failure to recognize the intensity of his internal world. These missed signs now serve as a somber reminder of how easily warning signals can be overlooked. Neighbors described small but telling behaviors. Long periods of isolation in the guest house, sudden bursts of anger over seemingly trivial matters, and intense focus on routine activities. He sometimes appeared hyper-focused on trivial details in household management or family schedules, noting patterns or behaviors that others wouldn't have noticed. To most, these quirks seemed innocuous, even endearing. But the FBI and psychologists later interpreted them as early indicators of obsessive thinking, a pattern that would culminate in the tragic events at the estate. Family interactions, too, contained subtle warning signs. Friends who had observed arguments recalled that minor disagreements often escalated disproportionately when Nick was involved. Sometimes a casual disagreement about chores or schedules would trigger intense, emotional responses. Though these episodes were infrequent, they highlighted an underlying volatility that, if combined with fixation and resentment, could, and eventually did, lead to extreme action.